Okay, so we're going to be getting started today, and as part of this, we're going to be building models as normal within the class. So I'd like you to go and invoke that script that will allow you to run AnyLogic on that machine, and I'd like you to start AnyLogic up. So within this class, and for at least the next class, we will be talking about introducing a new element into the sort of models that we have been building up. This element is something that is called nonlinearity. And it makes all the world of difference in the behavior seen in these models. It also makes all the difference in terms of the techniques we can use to understand these models. But this is not an aspect of models alone. We talk about nonlinearity in the context of models, as captured in models, because systems that we deal with in the world are often nonlinear. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts in these systems. You can't take the system apart into pieces, understand each of those pieces, and thereby immediately understand the system as a whole. It's not just the pieces, but the connections between the pieces that matter. And often the behavior of the whole will be radically different from the behavior of any one piece or the average of that behavior. And within today's lecture, within today's discussion, within today's example, we will be seeing a little example that exhibits many of these features. I want to give you a glimpse of them as AnyLogic is coming up for you, and then we will dive into exploring them with an actual little model. Okay? If we go back to this, I had mentioned the significance of nonlinearity that I'm going to emphasize the most is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. If we want to understand the behavior of a system with respect to some change, maybe it's some policy, maybe it's a combination of policies, we can't just understand its response to each policy in isolation and then say, well, if we combine them, if we do both, we're going to get a total gain that's just equal to the gain from each in isolation. Often they interact or they'll work at cross purposes. We intervene upon a system by, maybe it's a computer system, and we want to speed up the network. And we add a router, a faster router, and maybe we add a faster server. And the results of doing that together may be very different. The gains from doing that together may be very different from the gains we get from adding a router by itself or adding a faster server by itself and adding them together. May be very different. So when we have these nonlinear systems, sort of the response of the system to the sum of two variables is often very different from the sum of the system itself applied to each of those components. Think about F here as being the response of the system to an intervention, to a change we make, widening a road within Saskatoon, adding a bridge within Saskatoon. Those might be interventions that we could undertake. In the public health context, maybe it's putting in place a screening program for some underlying health issue and putting in place a vaccination initiative. Here, we could consider each of these interventions in isolation, consider their gain, but the result of combining them can yield a gain that's very different. Similarly, and I show this at the bottom here, if we scale up a policy, if we widen a road by 2 times versus by 4 times, we don't just get twice the level of gain by doing it by 4 times as we gain by increasing it by a factor of 2. At some point, it no longer becomes the bottleneck. It no longer becomes the place where traffic builds up. Instead, that traffic builds up somewhere else. We've just shifted the bottleneck to something else. And we don't gain an equal amount by doubling it as we do by increasing it by a factor of 4. So scaling up effects can be very different. We gain something in the first, increasing it by a factor of 2, but not by the successive factor of 2. So we're dealing with linear systems, and many systems are approximately linear for regions of their behavior. We have a very nice situation where the behavior of a system to our pushes at it, our interactions with it, our the policies we put into place, or the interventions we perform, to the changes we make to it, to the changes to its input. To understand those changes to the input, we need to understand each little element in the system. And having done that, we can understand the behavior of the system as a whole. And one of the nice features of this, how many people in here from engineering background? Okay, great. One of the nice features of this is a very strong component of engineering curriculum. And I don't know if you would have, Wade, is it? If you would have reached this point in your engineering education where you've seen Fourier analysis or frequency domain components. It's a beautiful idea, folks. If you want to understand how something behaves in response to a waveform, a circuit behaves in response to a waveform, the waveform may be very unusual in its shape. You know, it may be, for example, a jagged wave that looks like this. If you want to understand how the system will respond to that when you feed it into the system, what you do with Fourier analysis is you take this apart into sinusoids. You take it into and you consider it as a sum up of sinusoidal waves. So maybe we have a wave that kind of goes like this, and we sum it up with a wave that's higher frequency and goes at a faster speed. And we basically consider the original wave. We take it apart into these pieces, and we know, often in a very elegant fashion, how the circuit will respond to each of those sinusoids, and that gives us immediately the understanding of how it behaves with respect to an arbitrary wave. We take it into pieces, we figure out how it will respond to those pieces, and that tells it about how it responds to the sum of those pieces. It's a superposition principle, sometimes called. And it's a beautiful theory. And there's a lot of areas where the world is approximately linear for a certain degree. This paper exhibits linear response. I pull at it, it pulls back at me. Pull harder, it's pulling back. And it works pretty well for a certain regime. But if I end up pulling hard, it goes plastic. It goes nonlinear. Sorry, Alan. Believe me, I'll remember. So if I pull hard, sorry, he wrote me a note. Please submit his mark. So believe me, it's committed to memory. But systems often pull back. They stay linear for a while. We pull too hard, they're no longer linear. Real-world systems are like that. It's not just pieces of paper. It's not just rubber bands. It's not just the response of tires on a car or what have you. It's projects that are like that. There's resilience in projects. Take a software project, software development project. For a certain while, it can take some pushes. Maybe it's a sprint for the latest release to get out a new release of the software. Maybe it's a long session on a couple nights to fix some bugs so you can release it to testing, what have you. Teams can often be resilient in this way. They bounce back. Why do they bounce back? Well, after that sprint, people might feel pretty good about what they've done. They take a bit of time off. They go on vacation. Maybe they take a bit of time outside of work to make up for all the extra time they've been putting in and so on. They may go and, as a team, decompress together by, taking a trip together, seeing a movie or what have you. But at some point, things don't respond that way anymore. The team is stretched. It can't bounce back as readily because there's just one more deadline, one more pressure, one more issue that needs to be resolved. And at some point, the teams fall apart. It goes nonlinear. And that resilience, that pulse, it comes apart, and the team will fall apart. I've seen it happen. I've been part of teams where that's happened. And it can go very quickly at that point. A team that was doing great, high morale, very enthusiastic, high quality results, low turnover, and good output turns into a team with high turnover, high burden of documentation because of that turnover, a lot of time spent training new people who aren't up to speed yet or interviewing people. The code quality is really reduced. The customer isn't happy. They put in even more hours to try to make the customer happy. It drives fatigue up even more. And the team starts getting fatigued, burnt out, and people leave, and it goes to hell in a handbasket in 6 months. It's real stuff. It's not pie in the sky stuff. Systems are resilient to a point. And one of the worst things you can do, as you folks may know from my videos, when you're under pressure like that, you eliminate the resilience. You eliminate the elasticity, the ability to pull back on the system in a way that allows for decompression. And that's when it can go nonlinear. It can go into this plastic regime. But there's a lot of systems in the world that are nonlinear. We typically deal with nonlinear systems in many areas. Human area is one of them, but technology areas are another. We can't simply double the size of a server in terms of the response, the throughput of a server, and expect our network to speed up correspondingly. The bottleneck is elsewhere. We live in a nonlinear world. We live in a world where the whole is often not simply the sum of the parts. And when we're making decisions, we need to take that into account. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we will be exploring our first little taste of nonlinearity. Okay? And we're going to do so by building up a model together. This model will build on a model we built earlier, but it will do so in a way that will add a new component. Okay? Now, I think it was two sessions ago, we built a model like this. It was called Introductory SD model. I called it Introductory SD CMPT 394. And we divided a population into susceptible, infectious, and recovered. Do you remember that? Do you remember this model? Do you have access to it? If you do not, how many people do not have access to this on your computer? Should have saved it away. Okay, well, one or two. Okay, Josh wasn't here. He's joined the class since we built that. If you could pull up to someone who does have it, that would be great, because we're going to be going through some exercises that build the top of this, okay? Okay, anyone else need to pull up? Okay. So here we had a model that involved individuals who were susceptible. They could get infected, and they became infectious, or so we were told by the name. They went through a recovery process, and they were recovered, and after some period of time, they came back to a susceptible state. Now, all was nice with this model, and we used it to examine effects of, well, what did we see when we ran this model? Does anyone remember what we saw? Anyone remember? What did we see occurring within this model? We started with, I think, everyone susceptible, no one infectious, and no one recovered. What did we see? What site lay before us? Alan, prepare for deployment. Okay. Oh, I ran the wrong model. Sorry, folks. right-click on this model. If you have two models open like me, right-click on the correct model. Okay. So here we see. And what do you think is going to happen with susceptibles? If everyone starts here, no one in infectious, no one in recovery. What do you think is going to happen for this model? Remember, what was the formula for these infections? Anyone remember? I'll give you a hint. It's a first-order delay. What is it? Force of infection is the probability per unit time someone will get infected. What do you think the formula for this is? Susceptible. That's right. They have if each person has a 10% chance of getting infected, and you have 1,000 people on average, you have 100 people. That is 1,000 times 0.1 people going from susceptible to infectious per week. If 10% chance of infection per week. Similarly, we had a first-order delay from infectious to recovered. Remember that? What's the formula for this? If this is a mean time in this state, in this infectious state, what's the formula for this flow? That's right. That's exactly right. Wade got it right. So we know it makes sense dimensionally because what's the unit of this? People. Number of people in the state. What's the unit for the flow? People over time. People over time. Yeah, where time here happens to be days. So that's good. So it's divided by. Remember first order delays? If it's a chance per unit time of transitioning, the formula is going to be times it. Probability per unit time. People times probability divided by time is people per unit time. A probability is the fraction of coins that turn up heads. Therefore, it's dimensionless. It has unit dimension. It's coins over coins. And so it has unit dimension. Coin flips over coin flip. Coin flips that turn up positive over coin flips that turn up negative, the total coin flips. This is a probability. It has unit dimension, as we say, 1, and we're multiplying. And so we have a probability per day, and we multiply it by persons, and we get out a persons per day as the unit, person per day. Okay. So that's why the dimensions work for that one as well. This is a probability per day, the force of infection. Great. And then we had recovered, go back, and just as a sanity check, make sure everyone's with me and not surfing the web. What's the formula for this waning of immunity, given that we have a mean duration of waning immunity? What's the formula for this guy look like? Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Okay, so this is great, and if we ran this model, what did we see over time, if everyone started here? These are 3 successive first-order delays, and they're going in a circle. What do we see? Speak, use, as if in one voice. Susceptible starts on high, and slowly goes down, and then infectious peaks early, goes back down, and recovers. That's right. Good. That's right. So they're going up, and susceptible is going down, and number of infectious goes up, but it reaches a peak. Why does it reach the peak? What's different when it reaches the peak? When it's flat, what must be the case for infectious to be just flat? No, not going up, not going down. What must be equal? Infections equals recoveries. Darn right. Exactly. So at that point, inflow equals outflow. It's not rising, right? Initially, it rises because there ain't nobody to recover. There's nobody in infectious. There's nobody in recovered state. And therefore, initially, nobody's flowing out. People are coming in. It rises. And then eventually, it reaches this peak, and it starts to decline. What does it start to decline? Well, there's fewer and fewer susceptible people who become infectious. Number of susceptible has gone down, and there's lots of infectious people to recover, so it starts to decline. Remember that? And if we go and run this thing, what we'll see is actually it goes to a steady state. Steady states are the nature of the game with first-order delays and more generally with negative feedbacks. They tend towards stasis. They want to keep the system in balance. So it goes towards an equilibrium. Okay? Towards an equilibrium where things are in balance. And this equilibrium is maintained even if we perturb it. So you may remember that we have before perturbed it by, for example, adding in. So imagine a busload of folks who are in this state called infectious come in here. So I'm going to go and I'm going to click on this and I'm going to set this to 1,000 people. Watch this. I'm going to set it to 1,000, and what do you think is going to happen in terms of the fraction who are infective? Well, it's going to go up, right? It shoots up, the fraction infected, but then it shoots down again, and it comes back to the same fraction. Not the absolute number, because we added people to the population, but it's back to the same fraction. This system resists. It's stable. It resists perturbing. Now, but this model, moreover, ladies and gentlemen, is currently linear. Why do I say it's linear? Well, go look at the formulae. Here we have a formula. It's number of susceptible times the force of infection. It depends linearly on susceptibles. Linearly, it's just susceptible times some constant. Number of recoveries, infectious divided by recovery time. Once again, it boils down to a stock times or divided by some constant. You can treat it as either one. Recovered, this waning of immunity, it just depends linearly on the number of people who are recovered. It's a linear model, ladies and gentlemen. It's a linear model. We're going to see the same behavior here. If we doubled the size of the population, if we tripled it, if we doubled the size of every stock, we'd see the same fractional number that end up in each state. It'll always, moreover, go back to the same equilibrium value. There's no variation in that. Those are all signs of stability. Those are all signs of characteristics of a linear model. Let's go change it. We're going to make this model, ladies and gentlemen, nonlinear. Okay? Are you ready? You fired up? Okay. Okay, so I'd like you to save this model, do a save as, and then we're going to say introductory nonlinear SD. Oh, it just changed it to CMD 395. Okay, well, that's an interesting idea, but it's 394. It tries to be smart about the version number, not realizing it's a class designation. Okay, so we just saved this, and truth is, ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you a little bit ashamed, because we gave these things tempting names, infectious, but we called infections, but nobody's actually infecting anyone else here. There's no infections going on between people. We said these folks are infectious who are in this stock, but they're not infecting anyone. The risk of a given susceptible getting infected in this model right now, it's independent of how many infectious people there are. If there's 0 infectious people, as there are at the start, or if there's 999 of them, you have that same chance if you're susceptible of getting infected. And what is that chance? It's given by this constant for force of infection. Go look at it. Go look at it there. Force of infection is just a constant. So I feel I've been pulling the wool over your eyes a little bit, but I've done so for a reason. And that reason today, in this very classroom, in this very hour, will reach fruition. Okay? So, ladies and gentlemen, you'll notice that I artfully left this component here as what sort of variable? Does anyone recognize it? It's a dynamic variable, is exactly right. Dynamic because it's going to change from a number to a formula. And from whence will that formula come? From the mouths of babes, from you folks. So on what must this depend? For those who have watched the video, give me some types of things on which this force of infection. If I'm a given susceptible, give me one thing that my chance, if I'm dealing with something like a common cold, or dealing with something like influenza, or like TB, dealing with something that's a much more serious infection, what's one thing, if I'm a susceptible, on which my risk of contracting that, of developing that disease must depend? What else that's already in the model? It must depend on number of infectious people. If there's nobody around me who has a common cold, I'm not going to get it. If there's nobody around me who has influenza, I'm not going to get it. If there's nobody around me who has pertussis, I'm not going to get it. If there's nobody around me who has TB, I'm not going to get infected with it, okay? Okay, so force of infection has to depend on the number of infectious people. What else might it depend on? Well, think about yourself as someone worried about getting influenza. What sort of things might you be worried about for getting influenza? What sort of things would be risks for you getting it? Being around other people. Beautiful. So my contact, how many, but I can't just say, how many contacts do I have? 10. It's got to be something like 10 per day. It's got to be a rate of contacts, a certain number per day. So we call it the contact rate. And then, if we consider that, there's something else that matters. Whether those folks are sneezing into their elbow or sneezing into the air, wide open. Whether they are exercising proper hygiene. Now this comes in with influenza. It also comes in with other infections. Sexually transmitted infections, right? Whether they're using a condom. If, in terms of HIV, are they sharing needles with each other? They may be spending time around each other, but if they're each using different needles to inject drugs, they're not going to be spreading it from one to the other. It's if they're sharing it. So there's a matter of hygiene. If two people are in contact, what's the likelihood? So if I'm a susceptible, I'm in contact with an infected, what's the likelihood that infection will be transferred to me? So contacts is part of the picture. The number of infectious people and the risk per so-called discordant contact, between a susceptible and infected, all those play a role. So, ladies and gentlemen, from the mouth of babes came wisdom. Okay? So let us put that wisdom into practice. So we are going to go and we're going to walk through our reasoning. Okay? So this force of infection, how might it depend on these things? So let's add a contact rate parameter. So we'll have mean contact rate. People per day per person. Number of people that I contact as a given person in the population. Okay? Okay? And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to set this to a value of 12. Okay? 12 people per 12 people contact with 12 people per day. Okay. So that's good. Now, of those people, of those 12 people with whom I come into contact, what fraction of them are going to be infected? Well, let's suppose it's in a bus station, or suppose it's in an airport, or suppose it's in the context of a large gathering, like a church gathering with lots of people around. The fraction of those people I run into who might be infected might be pretty similar to the fraction in the whole population. Do we have that in the model? Prevalence of infection. That's exactly right. We already have that in the model. So we're going to say, okay, of those 12 people with whom I come into contact, suppose that in the whole population, 50%, 0.5 fraction, on a fraction basis, of that population is infected or infectious, the prevalence of infection. Of those 12 people per day, how many people do I come into contact with that are infectious? 6. 12 times 0.5. Does that make sense? For each of those 12, each of them, I say it's a coin flip. They have a 50% chance, because 50% for the whole population. Good. And now, in what some of you will recognize as an approximation, but it's a very good one for many circumstances, we're going to ask, okay, suppose each contact between me and a person who has infection, each of those 6 people, suppose it gives a probability of a small probability, say 0.04, that I will get infection. What's the probability that I'll get infected from anyone? Well, probability I'll get infected from the first, from the second, from the third. In a common approximation that's often used, is we'll just take the number of infectious people times the probability of getting infected from each of them. So I'm going to have contact with 6 infectives per day, and each of them I'm going to have a 4% chance of getting infected from, so it'll be about 0.24 probability of getting infected myself per day. Does that make sense? 12 people total. Of those 12, 6 are infected. Where did that 6 come from? 12 times 0.5, the prevalence of infection in the whole population. And for each of those people, 0.04 chance I'm going to get infected. So 6 of them times 0.04 to give me a total probability of 0.24. There's an approximation there, but it's a pretty good one when it's a small chance of infection. And I won't be going into that, but be happy to elaborate on it for office hours. So, ladies and gentlemen, for the force of infection, we need one more component, which is the probability of transmission. Okay? And that's probability of transmission from a susceptible to an infective. You may even want to say that. So, force of infection will depend on all these things. So we need to hitch it up with these links there. Okay? Hitch it up with the links as I'm drawing it. Okay? So we need a link from contact rate, we need a link from prevalence of infection, and we need a link from probability of transmission. Okay? Okay. Now, you ideally in a Greek chorus will all tell me what to put down for this force of infection. So what do you think we need to put down? I'm sorry? Good. Multiplication. But let's walk through the reasoning one more time. Please make note of this reasoning, folks. Please. Each year, I mark the exams. And very often, a student will forget one of these terms. They'll leave it out. And if you walk through the reasoning, you'll understand it. So, this force of infection is going to represent what's the probability a given susceptible will get infected per day. And so, to figure that out, we have to consider how many people they're having contact with per day. And that's given by mean contact rate. And then for each of those people, what's the chance they'll be infected? For each of those 12, what's the chance they'll be infected? Prevalence of infection. So we're going to have prevalence of infection. And then what's the final component? For those, so that 12 times 0.5, say, 0.5 across the entire population is infected. So we're going to say of those 12 with whom I have contact per day, 6 of them per day are going to be infected. That is, mean contact times prevalence of infection. For each of those, I have what probability of getting infected if I'm a susceptible? If I'm a susceptible, what's my probability of getting infected from each of those infectives? Probability of transmission. Okay. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the coup de grace. that's sort of that gives the force of infection. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we already have infections. The number of people per day getting infected is that force of infection, that probability per day of getting infected, times susceptible. Sorry, I had a shorter run this morning. I only could do about a mile and a half, so I thought I'd increase it. Add some energy to the room, okay? Okay. Call it a victory lap if you want. Okay, so let us build early, build often, okay? Sorry? Oh, thank you. Who was that? Great. Arlen? Yeah. Good call. Probability of transmission was 0.04. Mean contact rate was 12. Prevalence of infection is an endogenous quantity. Explain that statement to me. When I say prevalence of transmission is an endogenous quantity, what do I mean by that? It's given to me by, it's calculated as part of the model. It's generated by the model. I don't tell it, assume this probability of transmission. It's actually generated by it. By contrast, mean contact rate is an exogenous parameter. I tell it what to assume for that, right? And as the model grows, what that boundary is will shift over time. Okay, are people comfortable with this? Should we run the model? How do you think its behavior will differ from before?
Nothing will happen.
Okay, why not? Good. So, something very significant was just said. Mark the words here. Is its behavior the same as before? No, its behavior is radically different, ladies and gentlemen. Completely different. Its behavior involves everyone remaining susceptible, no one getting infected. Why? Because there's nobody in the infectious state. The fate of those who are in susceptible state is tied up with the number of people who are infectious. Before, they were all independent solitudes. I had a certain chance of going from susceptible to infective per unit time, and that was independent of how many people were already in that stock or already recovered. It didn't matter. I had that same kick of the can every day to go from susceptible to infectious. And now it's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite. My chance of going from susceptible to infectious actually is tied up with whether or not there are people in here. It's no longer the pieces. The whole behavior of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. No longer can each person be considered in isolation, and then we know the behavior of the whole. Now, where people are throughout the system strongly influences the trajectory of others. So, my chance of getting affected depends on how many people are over there. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's go back and let's set susceptible to be 999. And we will start one person infectious. Just a single person. What do you think will happen? How did I do that? Susceptible starts at 999, infectious at 1. Alan stands ready to serve. Okay? What do you think will happen now? Will anyone get infected? What's going on there? What's happening? Can anyone characterize the difference from before? What do you see as different? I'm sorry? Oscillations is right. We have oscillations here. The oscillations are pronounced, particularly at first, where you have this rise in the number red and then a sudden decline. What is the number red? What do the reds represent here? Infectious people. So what you see here is an outbreak. Sort of takes off. takes off very, very quickly, ladies and gentlemen. It didn't before. We started 0 people infectious and nothing happened at all. And now we see something totally different from this. We see something entirely different. We see a situation where the system yields a very different outcome, where we see oscillations occurring. We're going to come back to these oscillations. But you'll notice if you run it enough, if you run it further out, you will see it coming into a sort of equilibrium of sorts. Okay? There's an equilibrium. So there is an equilibrium achieved, but it's only after a variety of oscillations. Let's try another thing, ladies and gentlemen. Does anyone remember, not 15 minutes ago, from this very classroom, we were running the model before when force of infection was still exogenous, meaning was still a constant. Remember, we perturbed the system. I added 1,000 people who were infectious. And what happened in terms of the fraction of people who were in different categories? What happened as a result? Anyone?
Jumped and then returned to the same equilibrium.
It jumped and returned to the same equilibrium. I'd like to challenge you now. And pedagogically, I would have been a little bit better off doing this before, but I'm going to ask for your patience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to go and run this model in the same way, but we're going to run it out until it goes through a couple oscillations and settles down into this kind of stasis. Are folks seeing this? If anyone's not seeing this, Alan sits ready to serve. Okay? Who else would like Elenian help? Okay? Okay, great. Okay, so let's run this out. We're going to try to explain those oscillations in a bit, but let it run to a steady state. Okay, it's approximately in a steady state here. Do you see that? Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something radically different. Those from public health backgrounds, take note. I'm going to undertake a situation where I eliminate, maybe through a rapid screening program, I eliminate the number who are infectious. What do you think will happen now? I eliminate these people who are infectious. What will happen? I've just perturbed the system. Do you think it will go back to the same state? Okay, watch this. Yeah. Okay. What's going to go on? Just as Arlen prognosticated, it's approaching a situation where it's purely susceptible. Do you see that? Do you see that? What did I do? I just changed the number susceptible here to 0, and it actually went back to a very different situation. I perturbed it, and it didn't just bounce back. Ladies and gentlemen, it exhibits a certain local stability. If I push it too much, eliminate the number that are susceptible, it goes into a different regime. It's in a totally different situation now. And now, let's add in the most minor of disturbances. Someone flies into the Saskatoon airport with Ebola. Okay, not Ebola wouldn't be a great example, but with smallpox. Okay, we're going to, okay, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying, okay, so here someone flies in. We have one person who's infective. What do you think is going to happen? Is it going to stay in stasis? Is it just going to bounce back? Is it going to bounce back to this same situation with everyone susceptible? There's an outbreak, and we get it going to a very different equilibrium, a very different state of balance. Ladies and gentlemen, nonlinear models can exhibit multiple equilibria that are very different. Multiple situations that are each in balance, very qualitatively different. We had a situation just moments ago where the entire population was susceptible. No one infected. By adding one person in, we reached a situation where it's in balance again, but a very different balance. It's kind of like the tale of two software teams. One constantly fighting fires, having that high turnover, having difficulties keeping people, having difficulties hiring people, hiring good people, difficulties with code quality because it's being written by very novel developers who have been hired, don't have a history with the code base, an unhappy customer putting pressure on it and therefore working long hours, and you're in this vicious cycle of sorts. That's one equilibrium, a particularly adverse one, versus a situation where those same individuals, led perhaps by a better manager with better response, doesn't burn them out. They have that high code quality, low documentation burden, high attention to quality assurance, satisfied customer, low turnover, good morale, etc. Two very different situations associated with a given situation, and you can push it from one to the other through enough actions. Public health individuals speak. Those from public health background, speak up. Where do you see this situation? Where do we try within public health context? Try very, very hard to achieve this qualitative difference between where we go from a situation where we have this sort of balance with infection remaining in the population to a situation where we actually wipe out that disease. Where do we try to achieve that? Anyone? Smallpox, polio. We try to eradicate these diseases, and once they're gone, short of military intervention or what have you, they are, reintroducing them, they are gone. But actually more than that, for many decades, childhood infectious diseases like pertussis, rubella, chickenpox, measles, mumps, we achieved this through what? Through immunization campaigns, through vaccination. We completely qualitatively changed the situation. So instead of being every few years a big outbreak of measles, you had it essentially almost imperceptible levels within the population. A few people a year who might have come from overseas and didn't have an immunization record, or a few people that for whatever reason fell through the cracks when they were young and might get it from one thing or another, but it doesn't penetrate the population. Ladies and gentlemen, here you have a situation where you have these two very different circumstances, and we can nudge the population from one to the other. These sort of nonlinear models are much harder to solve. For those from an engineering background, when we have a linear system, we can analyze it. We can analyze it through some quite elegant matrix mathematics, linear algebra. We can analyze what's its behavior. We can decompose signals into pieces and reason out its behavior to each of those, and therefore reason about its whole behavior. With nonlinear systems, we can't do that in general. We cannot solve them except by simulating them. A little bit like solving the halting problem. How many people in here know the halting problem? Oh my gosh. Halting problem? Oh, going once, twice. Maybe they hit it in fourth year, I hope. So the halting problem was one posed by one Alan Turing. And it asked, could a computer solve a problem where, given a description of a program, it could return a yes or no answer? Does that program halt? Or does it just run on forever? If you give it a program, could it return yes or no? And he proved that you cannot have such a computer. There's no program in the world, no computer, no matter how powerful, that can return a yes-no answer at that level. The only way you're going to be able to figure out does that program finish is by running that program for long periods. You're never guaranteed that if you ran it just another day yet, maybe it would finish. And so it is with simulation models. We can't know ahead of time how it will behave without simulating it for a nonlinear model. We can't reason about how it behaves with respect to pieces and say, that's how it would behave in general for these sorts of inputs. Instead, we have to run it out. We have to run it out in a fashion that actually simulates out over time the behavior over time, as in a dynamic model. Okay, let's play around with this a little bit more. Okay, I'd like you to stop it, and I'd like you to run it here. And we're going to see something a bit different. We're running it out until it's in rough equilibrium. After all, this thing gets into a sort of equilibrium where it's a little bit resistant. Let's perturb it just a little bit, okay? Let's set infectious people from 28, let's set it to, well, maybe in yours it's not 28. Let's increase it by a factor of 10. Let's change it to, I'm going to change it to 38 here. You can change it to 10 more from what it is now in yours. Okay? I'm going to run it out a little bit more. What happens? Well, it bounces back. It's linearly, it exhibits sort of linearity around that point. It's not actually, it's not like it totally changes its behavior with any change. Watch this. We're going to change it back to 38. I'll try again. Watch this. It changes it a little bit, but it ends up bouncing back. It's not that nonlinearity means immediately the system will go wacko if you disturb it at all. It'll pull back locally, but with enough disturbance, ladies and gentlemen, enough disturbance to Alan's chagrin. Yeah, sorry. It's getting. This will make me remember even better. So it at some point it will change completely. So locally it may operate in a fairly linear regime, but overall it operates with nonlinearities for the model. Let's go see that further. So run it out a little bit. And now let's go change this, ladies and gentlemen. Suppose we could lower this probability of transmission by a factor of 2. So maybe this is through, if it's something like STIs, it may be through promoting condom use. If it's something like bloodborne infection, maybe through preventing, giving out needles so people don't share needles. If it's something like an infection that's spread through droplets within a hospital, we might provide people with masks to lower the risk of inhaling things, or what have you, or clean surfaces. So let's change the probability of transmission from 0.04 to 0.02. What do you think will happen in terms of the prevalence of infection, the fraction that are infective here? What do you think will happen? What do you think will happen to the fraction that are susceptible? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, so look what happens. Okay, we see an oscillation. We're going to come back to that. Why do we see that oscillation? But what we see is actually we end up getting a prevalence of infection and a prevalence of susceptible that are significantly changed. In this case, this is more than doubled the fraction of susceptibles, for example. Okay, let's try further changing that. Let's make it, instead of probability of transmission 0.02, let's try 0.01. Let's plug that in. Okay, what do you think's occurring now? shifting to the other equilibrium, at least just about. Oh, look at that. Now you have some very long wave, sort of long-term waves here. And it's oscillating, but in a very small way. Okay, let's try it one more time lower, 0.005. We've lowered it by a factor of 8 times. Let's try this. Wade got it, exactly. Now it's shifted to this other equilibrium. Just by changing the parameter value. We're not probing the number of people in each state. We're not changing the number in a magic way who are infectious and removing them. We are just changing the parameter values. Do you see that? Did you see that? Okay. By changing the parameter values, we could knock it from one component to another, one area of behavior to another, one basin of attraction is the word that we use. It's almost as if there's different regions of space. In a space, if we think about the number of here, the number susceptible and the number infective, it's almost as if there's different regions of space where different things happen. And there might be some line here where on one side certain things happen, on another side another thing happens. Certainly if we have 0 infectives, it's a totally different situation. And then actually for this particular model, it's not quite what I've drawn here. But the basic idea is we have different regimes, almost like different catchment areas of a watershed, where water on one side will run down one way, water on the other side will run down another way. But you can push up and over into the other area. We'll be seeing some graphs of this. Okay, so we've seen now we can essentially eliminate infection from the population by changing these parameters. And that is much of the goal of public health in the sphere of infectious disease. It's achieving these dramatic changes, these qualitative changes. But by relaxing this, if we were to bring this back, well, let me ask you folks. Suppose stays at 0.05. Now suppose I introduce, watch this. Suppose I introduce someone into the population. Here comes somebody with this bug into the population. What do you think will happen? What do you think will happen?
There'll be a spike and then it'll go back down.
Good. There'll be a spike and it goes back down. Okay. Yeah. So it actually went down almost immediately. I'm going to bring in 100 people. Gosh. Okay. 100 people. Why does it go back down? Why does it bounce back like that? Because it's not capable of sustaining the infection. Essentially, those people are infectious, and they might infect 1 or 2 people, but there's not enough probability of transmitting it on and on and on for it to actually spread efficiently. It's like wet wood. The fire doesn't spread effectively, so it tends to go out. Yeah, it might catch this log and get enough of the water off of that one to let it ignite, but at some point it's just going to go out. It doesn't spread effectively. So here we could see resistance to sort of this thing catching. We could see resistance to the infection catching hold. But I want you to watch this. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to change the number of infectious here is so small. I'm going to change it to 0. Okay, I'm going to change it to 0 infectious people. And then watch this. I'm going to return, after changing this to 0, I'm going to return the probability of transmission, ladies and gentlemen, back to 0.04. What do you think will happen if I run it forward now? Anyone? What do you think will happen? Will anyone get infected? Will anyone get infected? Is anyone getting infected? Why not? Nobody to infect them. Remember, that means the prevalence of infection is what? Let me reason this through. If there's no one infectious, the prevalence of infection will be what? 0. And therefore, the force of infection will be 0. And therefore, susceptible times the force of infection will be 0. Therefore, the number of people here. Okay, so we're in a pretty okay state here for the moment. For the moment. But then what happens if we introduce one person back into this? One person. Think about northern Saskatchewan in the first part of the summer. Bone dry. We introduce one person in, and what do you think will happen? Now it starts all over again. Dramatic change. Ladies and gentlemen, this system, with the original parameters, is an unstable system. It's an unstable system, a system where an outbreak can gather steam, a system where one person getting infected, so I'll say number of infectious individuals here, number of infectious individuals. The more infectious individuals there are, the larger number of new infections, all other things being equal. And the more new infections there are, how does that affect the number that are infectious? Plus or minus? Plus. This is a positive feedback, ladies and gentlemen. What we're seeing here in this model is a positive feedback associated with this infection spread. Now, it doesn't go on forever. This positive feedback is not in isolation. After all, the number of new infections also decrease something that's critical, and it's going to be incredibly important to explain this behavior. What does a new infection decrease? Susceptible population. Beautiful. Beautiful. Who said that? John. Thank you, John. Susceptible people. And susceptible individuals are, as the number of susceptible individuals goes up, does the number of new infections go up or down? Up. This is a positive or negative feedback, ladies and gentlemen. Here. Negative feedback. It's a balancing feedback. It limits nonlinear regime. It limits the size of the outbreak. It provides a cap to how far this positive feedback can go. Positive feedbacks, like those you would have heard from microphones, many of you, they grow and they grow and they grow and they grow, but they reach a certain saturation point, a maximum point, a point where they can't grow anymore. And it's because typically some negative feedback has maxed them out. That as they've been building up, they reach the limits of the speaker capacity, or they reach the limits in terms of draining the number of possible customers, whatever. I would note that the same dynamic that we're seeing here is what a lot of companies dream of, where infections is not infections and infectious individuals are not infectious individuals per se. They are people with new infections, people who buy a given new iPhone, and infectious individuals are people carrying that new iPhone around, and other people eye it, and those other people are susceptible to influence, and then they go in and buy it. And as you build up market share, you hope for this virtuous cycle of expanding sales, of expanding customer base. But at the same time, you are depleting your source of possible new sales, because it's one more customer who buys it now, is one less who can buy it in the future. And you start depleting the number of people who will be future customers, future buyers. So there's a limit to how far these things can go. There are limits to growth. Okay, so we've seen some elements of this model. Elements of instability, elements of different equilibria, elements associated with virtuous or vicious cycles. Where is the nonlinearity here, ladies and gentlemen? Wherein lives it? Well, in this model, if I had to ask you to point out nonlinearity, as I am sometimes wont to do in final exams, I would point to a certain term within this model. And I'd like to unpack that term because it's the key term. Ladies and gentlemen, this model, most of this model, even as it stands before us now, are parts that are recognizable for you at the beginning of class. How would you describe the formula for this recovery? What sort of construct is this? If you consider the flow together with the stock, it's a what? We talked about it last time. It's a first order delay. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Yes, this is a first order delay. This too is a first order delay. They're phrased in the two, and I mean, these things here are both phrased actually divided by some recovery time, right? It's linear. It depends linearly on the number of people infected. It's just number of people infected divided by some constant, or alternatively, you could view it as times 1 over that constant, right? Times some constant. It's linear in terms of that. Where's the nonlinearity come in? Well, it happens to be the thing that we modified today. There, ladies and gentlemen. That's the heart of the matter. So where does the nonlinearity come in? Why do I say this is nonlinear? Wheretofore lies that nonlinearity? Well, let's consider the formula for a number of new infections. Okay? Can anyone help unpack that formula so that instead of depending on these niceties like prevalence of infection and force of infection, which are really names for formulas themselves, I want to express it in terms of only two things, in terms of constants and in terms of stocks, okay? And for brevity, and for your problem set, I will call the probability of transmission by a Greek letter. And what will that letter be? Beta. This is going to be probability of transmission. Okay? Technically, it's probability of transmission per discordant contact, per contact between an infective and a susceptible. Okay? Mean contact rate, I'm going to give a nice English letter to. And what will that letter be? C. This is mean contact rate. Notice it's a rate, number of contacts per day, say, right? Okay, good. So we've given those some nice names. And I'm going to call susceptible S and infective I and recovered R. Okay? So give me the formula for the number of new infections. I'll call it the rate of new infections. People per day. This is people per day. So give me the formula for it in terms of these things. Well, on what does force of infection depend? Remember, I taught you a way to think through it. They'll help you reproduce it when it comes time for problem sets or final exams. On what does it depend? We went through this 45 minutes ago. On what does it depend? On a contact rate, right? C. And then what else? Okay, there'll be a beta in here. But even before beta, it's prevalence of infection. Each of these people with whom I have contact, who said that? Name? Morgan. So each of these 12 people with whom I'm in contact, only some fraction of them are infective. If I'm a susceptible, my chance of getting infected doesn't depend merely on my whole contact with anyone. It's with contacts with infective people. So of these contacts I have with anyone, these are contacts with anyone per day. Some fraction of them are with infectives, and we're saying as an approximation, and we'll be questioning this in another few lectures, the fraction of them that are infected, of those contacts per day, is what? Okay, good. I'm gonna refine that a little bit. It's I over S plus I plus R, because it's a fraction. It's the number that are infective over the total number, right? Do you see that? Okay. So this is the number of infections is all of these, but then what else are we missing? What else are we missing here? Sorry? How many people are susceptible? Good. How many people are susceptible? Now, where's the nonlinearity? Well, it lies in one particular term here. The fact that we have this S times I. There are cases where it's also associated to be divided by S plus I plus R. But the fact that we have S times I makes all the difference. It means my chance of getting infected as a susceptible depends on you as an infective, how many people there are in the infective state. They're coupled together. It's no longer each in isolation. It's not merely the pieces. It's their relationship to each other. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So here, the fact that we can phrase this with an S times I times some, well, we have a constant total size, so ultimately this is by some constant. This makes all the difference. This means if there's no infectives, how many infections will there be? 0. If there are no susceptibles, how many infections will there be? 0. As a result, we will have a situation where we have no infections going on if either this is the case, if either this is 0 or this is 0. Okay? So we have here this key formula, and that was featured in that video, but I will, for those of you on that side of the room, I will go write that over there, because I realized that not everyone packs binoculars. I need to complete my jog. Okay. Sometimes I think it wouldn't hurt you folks to do a bit of jogging in the classroom too. We might get a bit more folks speaking up. Okay. So what we have here is a force of infection that is C times I over S plus I plus R. Give me the meaning of this term here. What is that? An intuitive level. What is that? Yeah, or the fraction. Percentage, 100 times that, but yeah. So that's the fraction of the whole population infected. It's 0.5 if half of them are infective, right? This is what is this here? This is the total population, S plus I plus R, right? This is the total population there, size of the total population. This is the number that are infective, right? So C times this, the total number of contacts I have per day with anyone, and that times the fraction of the population that's infective gives roughly the number of contacts I have with infective people per day, then times beta, right? This beta is for each of those contacts between me as a susceptible and an infective, what's the likelihood that the infection is transferred to me? So this is what is the force of infection. So this whole darn thing is the force of infection. Force of infection. It's my chance per day, per unit time, per day, say, if the time unit of the model is in days, of me as a susceptible getting infected. If I'm a susceptible, what's my chance of getting infected? And then, if we have that, what is the number of people getting infected per day? Give me the formula for that. S just S times this. This is a probability per day each of these susceptible will get infected. So the number of people getting infected per day is times it is the number of infections per day. This is the heart of this model. Everything else is first order delays. You recognize that? Everything else is familiar stuff. This is the heart of it. And wherein lies the nonlinearity? Upon what is this nonlinearity based? It's this term S times I. Because we can unpack this whole thing to be S times I times some constant. And the fact that we have a state variable, a stock, times the stock, makes all the difference. It means that the people in the susceptible stock depend upon, for what happens to them, it depends upon the number of people in the infectious stock. And it leads to this coupling, which leads to very different outcomes. So with nobody infected, the behavior is permanently nobody infected unless we perturb it. If you have someone infected, it leads to totally different behavior. Okay? We started with a discussion of nonlinearity. F of A plus B is not equal to F of A plus F of B. And that's true if F of A plus B is F of A is A times B. It's not going to be equal, F of A plus B is not going to be equal to F of A times plus F of B. Okay, so we're in closing minutes here. So all previous system dynamics models we had examined were nonlinear or linear with respect to state variables, but this one is not. And when we introduce this nonlinearity, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, it makes all the difference. It leads to instability. It leads to tipping points. It leads to oscillations and multiple fixed points in equilibrium, multiple states of balance that it can be in that are completely different. And this instability is things we see writ large in many areas. We see it, ladies and gentlemen, in the business cycles within our economy. We see it in terms of outbreaks of infectious disease. We see it in terms of attitudes towards things like vaccination, many, many different areas. We see it also across many different domains. The same regularities pop up in different jurisdictions in different places. Okay, and when we have nonlinearity, it has profound effects in many areas, including multiple policies. You can't just consider the gain from them together. You can't just consider the sum of the gains from each in isolation. Doubling your investment in something doesn't double the results. And it leads to multiple possible outcomes, multiple possible equilibria. And in this case, we saw disease-free equilibria where there's nobody infected in the population, as well as endemic equilibrium. So we're going to come back to this, and we're going to look at phase planes, where we see totally different behaviors if we start the system off in a slightly different situation. In one case, the infection may die out. In the other case, the infection may take off dramatically. We see very different depictions. All it takes is pushing it initially over a slight distance from here to here, and you can get it to die out. But once it gets into the state, it's very hard to change it. It's in a locked-in state. But that lies forward, ladies and gentlemen. For today, We've seen nonlinearity. These are the key equations. And by mastering those equations, you should be able to master the problem set. Okay? So that's all for today. I would remind people that if you do want to turn in your problem set, you can do so if I've asked you to turn in some model files as well as some answers to questions. You can do so by zipping them up and uploading them to the Moodle site. Okay? And also for those planning on pursuing projects, by default, unless we've worked out an arrangement otherwise, I've asked you to upload a brief description of what you're thinking about doing your project in. Something about maybe give a sense of the scope of the model. This does not have to be formal at all. It's to let me know what you're thinking of, roughly what you're anticipating. If your model doesn't require data, if it's more of a thought piece model, that's fine. But I've asked you to upload a brief description of it if you can by this weekend. If you are really interested but you don't have time to do it, just let me know for this weekend and I can give a little bit of an extension. The other point is there are some projects that are still seeking participants to help out with them. One of them involves simulation of farms and antibiotic resistance on particularly stock farms, so cattle and other larger animals. There's also some other teams interested, for example, working on trust and other areas. And if you have a very strong interest in pursuing a project with another team, just let me know and I could let you know of some that are still looking for people. Okay? So that's all for today. I'm going to hold office hours immediately after class. I'm trying to regularize the location for this, and I asked Heather to reserve me a room here. And for now, I think what we're going to do is we'll go to S371, which is, I think, the room down there, and we'll be meeting in there for office hours to avoid people having to all go over to my office. Okay? So thanks very much, and I'll try to send you some video to watch for Tuesday.